how to keep a healthy liver is critical for overall health because it can affect all other systems and all other organs of the body. So what we're going to look at in this tutorial is, first of all, we'll look at the liver and look at, in some respects, its role and what it's doing. Then we're going to start tying in some foods. So we're going to look at glucose. We'll look at what's happening in the liver and some fail-safes that the liver has to be able to manage the glucose. But also, we'll talk about some of the, let's just say, longer-term effects that high glucose can have. Then we'll talk about the liver and fructose, and again, some of the foods and some of the longer-term problems that can come from a lot of fructose over that period of time. And then we'll start looking at some foods that can keep the liver healthy. The liver itself is important for maintaining just everyday nutrients for cell metabolism and also regulating blood glucose. Now, we'll talk about blood glucose to start with and the effect that that can have. So, with regards to the liver and how it regulates blood sugar, it wants to keep it in a narrow range of 70 to 100. Now, these numbers, the specific numbers, aren't too important. They may mean not a great deal to you, but what is important is the mechanism, which we're going to be talking about. So this is if it goes too high, and next we're going to talk about if it goes too low, but we will kind of cover that now. So after a meal, blood glucose, so this is a carbohydrate-based meal, let's say, can increase to 120 to 150. Now, it can double, as you can see here, 70 to 150. So it can double. So it's a lot of extra blood sugar or blood glucose. So what then happens is the pancreas releases insulin into the portal blood. Now, the portal blood is essentially the blood that goes from the small intestine up to the liver. So when you take in food, it goes through the stomach into the small intestine. Then the small intestine, it absorbs into the blood. When it absorbs into the blood here, it goes into the portal vein, which then takes it up to the liver for processing. Before then, it goes out into general circulation. Now, if we get a lot of blood glucose, what the pancreas then does is releases insulin. Now, doubling portal insulin will shut down hepatic glucose production. And all that basically means is when insulin gets high in the portal blood, the liver shuts down creating glucose, because when it gets too low, so if it goes below these numbers, it will create and produce glucose. And I'll explain that mechanism on the next slide. But it will create that. But when it recognizes that there's insulin in the system, it will slow it. But if it doubles, it will shut it down. If it goes too low during fasting, now during fasting could be a like a premeditated fast that someone's doing for 24 hours or intermittent fasting, but that period where you're not eating something, you have this mechanism if your blood sugar goes too low. Glycogenolysis breaks down glycogen and allows the liver to release glucose into circulation. So it's a very simple process. You can see it here. You've got glycogen, glucose 1 or -1 P into glucose -6 P, and then you get glucose. So you've got glucose 6-phosphatase, and then you get your glucose molecule, which then goes out into the system. So if it gets too low, that's what happens. Obviously, I've just explained what happens if it gets too high, in so much as the pancreas releases insulin, and then the liver shuts down this process, because then it can use that glucose instead of having to create its own. But as I've mentioned, if we have prolonged insulin production or prolonged glucose intake, which then encourages prolonged pancreas insulin production, if that shuts down and burns out, that's when we start to get signs of high blood sugar and higher risk of diabetes. So from one perspective, from glucose, it can cause problems. So if we're taking in too much sugar, too many carbohydrates, that can become a problem. Now, when I talk about carbohydrates, I would say low fiber carbohydrates, because high fiber carbohydrates are much more effective at dealing with glucose and glycogen. So if we are going to be taking in foods, it would need to be high fiber foods. Another mechanism that it has is gluconeogenesis. Now, this sort of explaining the same point, but again, during fasting, it has another mechanism for maintaining healthy blood sugar, and that is essentially the production of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources such as fats, proteins, and lactate. So it's another way of maintaining blood glucose during fasting. And again, you can see the process here as it goes through. But essentially, what we're trying to say is, yes, the body has these fail-safes to be able to maintain it. But if we're constantly ploughing it in, day after day, week after week, month after month, possibly year after year, then eventually these mechanisms, or certainly the pancreas and the insulin, will burn out, will shut down, and blood sugar or blood glucose will become a problem, and then that can then lead into diabetes and the effects then of diabetes. So I guess the easiest way is to manage the amount of food we're taking in, and again, as I mentioned on the last slide, with regards to carbohydrates, it would need to be high fiber foods. Now it's fructose. Now this isn't necessarily fructose from fruit, because again we get the fibre that comes with the fructose, which changes the mechanism of how it's broken down in the body and how it's treated within the body. Now, when large amounts of fructose reach the liver, it can create fat via lipogenesis. This is the beginnings of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So when we're talking about fructose, I'm talking about different foods. So these are the heavily processed foods. So we take fructose in, again, as you can see here, then it goes through this mechanism called fructoolysis. It does its thing, and this is essentially the fatty liver. This is where it scars. So again, it's not, they're not effective foods. They're not healthy for the liver, because the liver, if you've watched any of my previous tutorials about the liver, they not only aid just general metabolism, as I've described earlier, but also detoxification of foods. And if it's not working effectively, if it's being shut down by this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, then it's going to start causing problems, because the foods being taken in aren't being regulated. Blood sugar isn't being regulated as well. If there's diabetes that comes along with it, which is the pancreas not working properly, then basically all this poor nutrition is going to flood the system and wreak havoc within the system and cause problems, which again I'll talk about on future tutorials. So finally, the foods. So foods that contribute to fatty liver. So these are the high fructose types of foods, and high, you could say, glucose as well, because they are going to have glucose in there. So you've got breakfast cereals. Now again, they're high sugar ones, so the sweeter ones. Breakfast cereals aren't, they may be fortified with many things, but what they don't tell you is the amount of fructose, high fructose cornstarch, and all the derivative or different names that same molecule has. You've got pastries, you've got soft drinks, you've got sweets, cakes, etc. So all those processed foods that are high in that high fructose type molecule are going to wreak havoc within the body. It's going to shut down the liver if you do it for long enough, because again, as I said earlier, the body has its mechanism, so it will do everything it can to maintain proper blood sugar, to help with diabetes. It will also do everything it can to manage the amount of fructose getting into the system before that creates its own problems, and that is to store it in the liver as fat. But again, if that gets too much, liver shuts down, it just gets through into the system and causes all sorts of problems. So foods that keep your liver healthy. Now, obviously, I've talked about carbohydrate foods with glucose and things like that. They need to be high fiber. Now, we've also got grapefruit, blueberries, grapes, beetroot, cruciferous vegetables. Now, all these foods are high antioxidants. Now I've got another tutorial about antioxidants and free radicals. So these types of foods create the free radicals. These types of foods have the antioxidants that neutralize the free radicals. So that doesn't mean because you eat a few grapefruits or a few blueberries that you can go around and stuff your face with pastries, soft drinks and sweets, because to be able to combat the amount of free radicals that's created here would take a whole world of food down here. But essentially, the easiest thing is to stop doing that and to start doing that. And hopefully, where these foods, it's like the generic, you go on any nutrition tutorial and they'll tell you to eat more fruit and vegetables and less of this. What I've tried to do is help you understand why, because your liver will effectively shut down if you keep it in the other ratio, if you eat too much of this and not enough of this. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully it gives you a better idea of why you're eating the foods that you're eating, and hopefully it could stimulate change if you're eating certain foods over other foods.